Hello there, I'm Kaz. We've seen a lot of strange things happen with the localization of games, be it with the content, translation, or lack thereof. This game, however, it has a strange history.
In 2010, Chunsoft released a visual novel on the PlayStation Portable in Japan called Danganronpa, Trigger Happy Havoc. It was a moderate success, receiving a sequel 2 years later, wound up being ported to mobile devices, an anime adaptation, several manga, and even has an upcoming midquel on the PlayStation Vita. Neither the PlayStation nor mobile versions of the game would ever see a North American release, let alone its sequel. However, both the original and its sequel would be re-released in a compilation for the PlayStation Vita in Japan on October 10th, 2013. And it's with this pairing of the first two games in the series where things get a bit strange. See, the Vita version of Danganronpa 1 and 2 was localized by NIS America, but each game was localized separately as opposed to simply translating and releasing the two titles as one cartridge in the West. Neither NIS America nor Chunsoft has ever clarified why they chose to release these two games separately. Whatever the reason for this decision, it's only now that we're getting the second entry in the Danganronpa duology, Danganronpa 2, Goodbye Despair. The first Danganronpa, released in February of this year, was not very good. It was a chore to trudge through its terrible story, as it tried to make itself seem smarter than it actually was, by referencing intelligent theories, when in fact many of the characters who bring them up made stupid decisions, and there were more plot holes than its Deus Ex Machina ending could try to cover up. Minority opinion or not, it failed to do much to impress in the wake of Zero Escape. So, with the sequel recently released, does Danganronpa 2 bring forth a bright future full of hope? Or is there even more dumb to despair in this dull retread of the original? Let's find out who done it in Danganronpa 2, Goodbye Despair. Given that Goodbye Despair is a visual novel and that the story is such a large portion of that genre, to keep this review as spoiler-free as possible, the footage shown will be in Japanese and will only go as far as covering the game up to the end of Chapter 1. The story opens up with Yu, Hajime Hanada, recently enrolled at Hope's Peak Academy. After blacking out at the entrance, he wakes up in a classroom with 15 other students and a mysterious rabbit named Usami, the teacher for his class, all just in time for a field trip. The students are on vacation at some tropical island, the goal of which is for them to bond with each other and gather hope fragments to create hope shards, leaving the island once they've completed all the hope shards. All those plans go awry when the villain from the first game, Monokuma, destroys Usami and takes over the class. With their teacher now powerless and the students full of despair, Monokuma once again begins his killing game. And when I say it begins once again, I mean that literally. Without wishing to spoil, those who played the first Danganronpa will quickly notice that, in spite of a change in setting, the characters are often plagued with the same cliches as before, the same plot elements are present, and a lot of the plot follows the same structure of the first Danganronpa. In fact, during the first trial, I swore they recycled the same dialogue from the first game. That's not to say it's all unoriginal material, nor does that mean it falls into the same traps that its predecessor does. In fact, on its own merits, Danganronpa 2's plot is perfectly serviceable, an enjoyable, if overly silly, narrative that's filled with intrigue at every corner. A lot of that has to do with the elements that help separate it from the original. The new characters, while still overwrought with cliches, are generally likable and the events unfold in a manner that makes more sense structurally. There's more of a desire to explore this mysterious island and uncover who, or what, its purpose serves. It also helps that it's much more self-aware of it being a video game full of tropes and cliches, which makes exhibiting some of the more crazy elements easier than the serious tone of its predecessor. That said, just because you make fun of your shallow pandering fan service doesn't mean it's not shallow pandering fan service. Also, never use emotes to tell your story. Ever. However, what truly sets it apart and raises it above its predecessor is the interactions between the characters. In the first Danganronpa, we were often told how certain characters would interact, but we were never really shown their relationships forming. In fact, there was one character who was staunchly against befriending any of the others because, well, it's a killing game. Why should they be friends with people who might try to kill you? There was never that moment which made you think, wow, what good friends they've become. They've had it rough, but maybe, just maybe they'll make it out of here after all. It's only near the very end of the first game where they feel like they've become friends, but even then, it felt more like an alliance of convenience than anything else. And no, the support conversations don't count as them befriending one another, as 1, the relationships they create are only shared between the main character, 2, are never reflected in the main narrative, and 3, rely on the player to have completed them for the relationships to even be remotely plausible. Here, their chemistry is on full display from start to finish, and it's simply splendid to see their interactions. There are several memorable moments where you see them bond with each other, hardships where they all have to struggle and get through, interactions which help develop them and those around them. You can see the beginning of the bonds they form and how they change along the way, which makes the harsh reality hit with full force when the player realizes that someone in their group committed murder. There's a great balance of the theme of hope for leaving the island alive, and the despair brought by the act of murder. It's still a ridiculous premise that no rational human being would even think of doing. The characters still act incredibly rational at times, and the ending, again, without wishing to spoil, really stretches your suspension of disbelief, but there's less plot holes and cliches clogging up the main narrative, with more time spent in character development and crafting an interesting world well worth exploring. Best of all, you don't have to have played the previous entry to enjoy the over-the-top plot. Danganronpa 2's story is stupid, silly, self-aware fun in the sun, and it's all the better for it. Goodbye Despair is a strange blend of Ace Attorney trials and elements of dating sims. Over the course of the game's 6 chapters, you will explore 5 islands along with the 15 inhabitants as you solve murders and form closer bonds in your free time. Navigating the island is simple enough, only having you run from one plane to the right till you reach your destination, as well as being able to instantly move to key parts of the map. There are some parts which bring back the cringe-inducing, clunky exploration of the first one, but they're short, and at least there's an incentive to put up with them. Every step you take earns you experience points to level up. With every new level comes an increase in stats for the class trials, be it more health, skill points, or so forth. Mind you, you can also earn them by interacting with the environment and characters, but it's nowhere near as fast as running around the islands. Once some time has gone by, a body will be discovered and it's time to investigate. It's fairly self-explanatory. Search the area for clues to use in the class trial as truth bullets. One annoying part is that you can't go to the class trial until you've found every single clue. It makes sense as far as the narrative is concerned in the class trials, but it would have made for a more interesting trial to see the other classmates be more productive than blindly agreeing with the statement they have no basis of logic to fall back on. The class trials are the most meaty portion of the game, certainly the most hardy. Once again, you choose from a set of skills you've unlocked and dive into a deadly trial to exploit and destroy any and all contradictions in order to uncover the truth. The difference between Trigger Happy Havoc and Goodbye Despair is how many new modes and minigames appear as the trials progress throughout the entire game. Variety is the word of the day, and Danganronpa 2 brings that in spades. The class trials offer more skills, more sections, and a greater challenge than ever before. There's returning sections like the non-stop debate and closing argument, but there's a few new additions to these parts, many of which I can't show you since they're introduced later on, like agreeing with the statement instead of refuting it during the debates. If a classmate disagrees with your argument, you'll enter into a rebuttal showdown, where you have to cut through their argument, quite literally, and shoot through their contradiction with the truth. These sections are a great addition, full of tension as you think on the fly about any contradictions or proof that will debunk a classmate's derailing theory. They're not all changes for the better. Hangman's Gambit makes an encore appearance in the most frustrating way possible. Instead of simply just shooting down letters, you attempt to match them, then shoot them down to spell out the correct word without any hint, all while making sure that different letters don't come in contact with one another. If they do, they'll explode and you'll take damage. And it's an absolute disaster, by far the most tedious part of the trial. What was, ultimately, a harmless addition for the sake of variety in the first game, turned into a tedious test of time as you tried to keep the letters you formed from blowing up, and tried to spell out the correct word. This becomes infuriating in later stages, especially when you're waiting around for the right letter to complete a sequence while the clock is ticking down on you. And while that's certainly frustrating, at least there's some thought process behind them, unlike the spot selection section, where you point out the most obvious standout in a still image. Not all these new additions are bad, on the contrary. It's just that most of them are introduced much later in the game and can't be shown off, such as Logic Dive, a VR minigame where you avoid obstacles and answer a series of 3 questions, usually with 2 to 3 answers. It's a really fun addition that balances logical thinking with fast-paced platforming. If they added in more types of obstacles and a few power-ups, this could have the potential to be a game of its very own. It's certainly more realized than some of the other mini-games Goodbye Despair includes, but more on that later. White Noise is still just as big as a pain as ever, but the new additions are a welcome bunch, and the changes made to returning stages make the class trials more enjoyable than those in its predecessor. Between exploring the island and completing the class trials, you had some free time to talk to the other characters and give them presents you earn by spending coins from finding hidden Monokumas all over the island and completing the class trials. This time around, completing these sessions will reward you with Hope Shards, which you can use to buy skills instead of just randomly receiving them in between their padded portions of writing. All of that is just one of the many offerings made by Danganronpa 2. In addition to the returning school mode, here called Island Mode, there's a more arcade-like minigame you can play after the first chapter, and a what-if retelling of Trigger Happy Havoc to look forward to once the credits roll. The quality of these additions are mixed. Magical Miracle Girl Monami has pretty poor controls, doesn't look very good, and overall lacks polish. It wears out its welcome very quickly, to say the least. The novel, called Danganronpa If, while amounting to nothing more than glorified fanfiction, is decently written and offers an interesting take on how the events in the original could have played out. I won't spoil it, but it's something that will definitely please those who went through the story slog of a tale that was the first one. There's also a pet simulator during the main game, but it's really not that special. It does allow you to get more coins for present and 2 special skills for class trials, but in the end it just comes off as a more simplistic Tamagotchi, a distraction at best. However, forgetting all the extra unlockables, Danganronpa 2 stands on its own fairly well. It's a much more well put together title than the preceding entry, and brings more than enough ideas of its own to keep everything feeling fresh. Finally, the presentation. Now, bearing in mind this game is a re-release of a PSP game on the Vita, Danganronpa 2 is still not a very impressive game in terms of visuals. While the newer character portraits are very crisp, the rest of the game's graphics lack any sort of attention to detail, with low polygon textures and certain older character portraits looking a little bit rough around the edges. The backgrounds aren't eye-catching, and a lot of the sound, music, and art assets are shamelessly taken from the original Danganronpa. To the first one's credit, the music was one of the highlights that Trigger Happy Havoc had going for it, and the new compositions are just as well done as its predecessor, with some catchy chiptunes thrown in for good measure. Speaking on the sound front, Danganronpa 2 offers both the new English dub and the original Japanese voice acting, which is always a nice bonus for purists, with the English voice acting being top-notch on all fronts. It is a tad difficult to hear the characters even after adjusting sound levels, so be forewarned. You're probably best off playing Goodbye Despair with a good pair of headphones on. The game also froze on me once, but after resetting it, I didn't have any more technical issues. At the very least, it didn't leave my save file.
As a sequel to a game that I didn't very much care for, in a genre I'm not very fond of, it was a pleasant surprise to see how enjoyable Danganronpa 2 turned out to be. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not as good as Zero Escape, and it hasn't made me a fan of the series or visual novels in general, but it's a fine game in its own right and a welcome addition during the ongoing gaming drought of 2014, earning a 7 out of 10. That's all for now, folks. Until next time, game on, my friends.